Hi there, my name is Alice and I'm an environment artist working in games. I mainly focus on stylized work, but I have a background in fine art and we'll be talking about concepts from that a little bit, so hopefully any realistic artist can take something away from this too. Today I'm going to be talking about trying to unify art direction in your personal projects. The first thing we often learn to do is making a prop, and it's usually a postbox, a treasure chest, or a World War II radio, and there's no shame. Mine was a treasure chest. Since we start with the basic workflow of taking something from high poly to low poly as the basic game workflow, sometimes there's a disconnect between that and making an entire environment that looks cohesive. Sometimes environments can look disjointed, with high quality props and then tiling materials that don't quite match, or foliage that looks really noisy alongside everything else. So how do we develop a cohesive art style for a personal project? Well, firstly we have to consider that art direction when you aren't an art director is difficult. Art directors will have years of experience, sometimes concept art backgrounds, they've seen multiple pre-production processes to develop an art style, and years of reference gathering and experience to pull from. So how do we try to mimic that in our personal projects when we might not have all that experience? It's a lot easier when you have art bibles and principals and seniors watching what you're making and giving that expertise, but in your personal work, whether you're trying to get your foot in the door or you've been doing this for years, there isn't necessarily that immediate support network and the pipeline for the feedback loop. So you have to build experience in other ways. Firstly is building up your support network of other artists. Engaging in communities and throwing yourself out there can be scary, but it's exactly how we all do it at work. You have to get feedback, you have to get approval. That can go somewhat for your own work, though you don't need approval, but getting that feedback from people you trust or people with other experiences can go a long way to improving your work in a shorter amount of time than it would to fumble around and figure it out yourself. Everyone you speak to will have different inspirations from all over, so you're getting access to that as well as technical feedback that's invaluable. There are plenty of Discords or Facebook groups or Reddit threads and forums you can engage in to get feedback to begin with until you've built a trusted support network. Here are just a few. Experience Points, which we're in now, Dynasty, The Club, the Hand Painters Guild, if you prefer hand painting your work, Stylized Station, if you're focused on stylized work, and Beyond Extent. The other side of developing your own art direction is getting those experiences yourself, which is the importance of secondary references. We probably all play games or have played games and will have a favourite at any given time. It might be your favourite because of the game design or mechanics. For example, I got Nintendogs Labrador and Friends one year for Christmas and it's one of my favourites. But it's not exactly revered for its art, much to my chagrin. As artists, we'll have games that we love because of art, and those are the ones we take inspiration from for our personal work. We see a lot of fan art with the goal of working for a certain company, which can be great for your career, and it might work, but if you want your own art style and your own direction, then we need to take reference, not technique. It's important to remember that all of these games we look up to and try to mimic elements of, they also have their own references and inspiration. They too had a mood board when they were developing their style, which takes us from primary references to secondary references. Secondary references are anything that aren't games or other game art. It's what fills in the blanks from being just a developer and a cog in the big machine to an artist with your own developed art style and direction and influences and eye. And developing that eye is what we're really talking about here, and that comes from secondary referencing. The films we watch, the style of certain directors like Stanley Kubrick's symmetrical compositions or Tarantino's trunk shots and fascination with toes, or TV shows that are known for their visual feasts like Euphoria or NBC's Hannibal, or any of Ryan Murphy's recent work. You can even look at music videos and comic books, and they will often have directors or artists that again have their own unique styles and can be broken down into color play, shape language, and recurring compositions. All of these things, be it modern or a bit nostalgic. I love the visuals in Spider-Verse, for example, which is a mix of traditional CGI and hand-painted elements and cutting-edge rendering techniques. But I'm also heavily inspired by the imagery in Princess Mononoke, which is largely traditional animation with only 10% CG. We've been positively assaulted with visuals in storybooks and comic books or adverts and magazines, and from that we have a little seed of an eye that we can now cultivate into our own eye as a developed artist. So watch films, play games, but savor it, break it down, and use it to influence your own art direction. So then if we have our own visual style and our eye developed, how do we find something to turn into a tangible piece of environmental game art? Well, having an eye doesn't mean you can create. You have to do the work to figure that out, which is a lot of practice and tutorials and feedback and mentorships, as we all know. But just because having your own visual style doesn't automatically make you an art director or a concept artist or a good artist at all, you do need to become one of those things. For finding your own concept, there are plenty of resources we can trawl through and save in our little desktop folders titled To Do. But there are more than just ArtStation with the concept art filter checked on. And all of these resources have slightly different search bar capabilities. So it's good to look through all of them when you're just getting started. Maybe you find the concept you're going to make one for one, which is great. There are a lot of talented concept artists out there making amazing work. Just make sure you ask for permission and you're all set to go. Or we can find lots of different concepts and photographs and cinematic shots, and we use that to develop a rough idea to start blocking out and referencing as you go, which might take a little longer, but if you're confident in your eye, then you can go right ahead. And some of us might want to make our own concepts, which some people might have the capabilities for. Maybe you started in 2D and transitioned to 3D. But concept art is a skill and a profession in itself, so let's not do it a disservice by pretending we can all be concept artists without putting the years into finding and mastering that craft that concept artists have. But if you have some abilities in concept art, or you can just understand your own scribbles, then it might be worth trying. If you've already built up references on the subject, the tone, the mood, and style that you want to make, a good midpoint is compositional thumbnailing. You can get yourself a white, a 25% grey, a 50% grey, a 75% grey, and a black, and start blocking out very rough shapes to give you an outline to block out from, like these references on the left. This might give you the initial direction for your composition, your shape language, and your block out lighting, and the rest you can develop as you go. But if you're feeling really self-assured, then you can try to move on to blocking out your colours and trying your hand at some concept art. It only really needs to substitute you enough to be able to build something on top of it. Maybe it's just getting your ideas across enough that you have a strong basis to manage your production. So you know you need these modular pieces and these unique props, which is enough to get started out with. I've made, quote, end quote, concept art. It's very ugly. It's not professional level concept art by any stretch of the imagination, but it does give me a direction to work from and come back to if I'm goal bossing too close to the sun. But say you've picked a concept, you love it, it's beautiful, it's the best thing your eyes have ever potentially feasted on, but you aren't quite sure how to translate some of it into 3D. Well, we can use our eye, our fundamental concepts, and prior 3D experience into turning a painterly concept piece that, again, you have permission to make, into a scene with an art style you've seen in 3D before. For this case, I'll be talking about classic stylized PBR that we all know and love. I fell in love with this concept by Nara on ArtStation, got my permission, and then wasn't sure how I'd translate it into PBR. I considered hand painting, but it wasn't the style I wanted to explore this time. So to start with, I'll take it into a painting program like Photoshop, desaturate it, or plug a black and white filter on it. Removing the color makes it a lot easier to read the shapes that reoccur in the concept. For this tree, I managed to pick out some boxy shapes from the bark from the brush strokes that have been used, which in painterly concepts is about seeing the brush economy and the implied detail. So for this piece, I found the shapes that were made with a darker stroke and a lighter stroke and combined them together to find a shape language that could be turned into physical 3D shapes, instead of making those details through albedo textures alone. And then once I've established the general rule of those shapes, it can be applied over the rest of the scene in the same way. As an example, I found another couple of really pretty concepts here and broken them down in a similar way, by finding their unique shape language. Breaking this first one down was easier since there was a lot of information to the right of the rock formation that can be carried through to the rest, but the painting becomes quite painterly as it heads into shadow. Since we can figure out the forms and structures from the right of the rocks, we can make a kit that fits together to explain the rest of the structure in 3D. This also works for the waterfall and the rocks in the back, and finding the general shapes of the foliage. Then the next concept, I also broke down the shapes, and then went a bit further into finding the techniques I already know to break down how I might start to sculpt this or make this in 3D, looking at which brushes I could create, what effects that they would make, and that will help in the next part of the process. This is when we actually get into 3D, into making assets. Firstly, once you've broken down the concept into shapes and forms, and hopefully techniques, we can practice how to achieve that effect ourselves. As an example, I have a tree that I made in my forest house scene that I had broken down before. I started by just making a normal tree with none of the bells and whistles and just practicing how I would get those forms and shapes when I'm sculpting. I did end up using this tree in the background, but it's important to not necessarily put weight on it looking good enough for your scene at this stage. Here we're just trying to get that muscle memory from your visual eye and your hard skills that you've built up whilst learning 3D. Knowing your softwares and tools and having explored other styles or ways of achieving a certain look will speed up this process. But if you're just starting to develop that, then it could take some time to hit upon something that you really like the look of, that has a basis in all of the references we spoke about before as well. It's where you start to mix your technical and physical artistic abilities and the foundation of visuals we've built up. Once you've built up that muscle memory and have a workflow that produces a result you're happy with, we can move on to a tangible benchmark asset that has a use in our scene. For me, I picked this little treehouse, as it's not necessarily the hero asset, but it's still complex enough that I can set a standard across an array of textures and materials like metal, wood, painted wood, etc. So I sculpted this using the same techniques as the practice asset, and then when I was sculpting the bells and whistles like the door, I tried to do it using similar brushes and similar bevel widths or softness that I had in the bark that I'd practiced with. Then once again you're happy with the sculpting or your high poly, however you've gone about making it, we can start to set a standard for our texturing process. For me, it was mostly ambient occlusion and a curvature generator, as well as position and a touch of the light generator to plaster some moss everywhere. The bark work is then bundled into a folder, as is the light wood, the metal, the painted wood, and then each folder is saved as a smart material once I'm happy. For this asset, I also had hand painted in some colour variation and wanted to break up the smoothness and sort of expected edge wear or highlights that you get when you use generators. So I did it by hand to arc back to the original painterly quality of the concept. This was done over and over on the same asset until I had a process that I liked that I could remember to do for the other uniquely textured assets. Once the benchmark asset is done, I know that this is the standard I want to hit every time, this is the fidelity and the noise level that I'm happy with, and these are the physical techniques and the workflow I've practiced that I can repeat to achieve the same thing over and over again when making assets for this scene in particular. Once you have a benchmark asset, maybe a blockout, some blockout lighting, however you work best, you can start to look at constructing everything else. Now anything that you make in a similar way, for example a uniquely textured high poly, low poly asset, should look consistent, but that's not the only way that we construct an environment. We have to consider tiling textures, trim sheets, shaders, VFX, potentially foliage, and even light, which are all different techniques, some of them even different specialisms and professions. So now we have to consider how to maintain consistency across all of these techniques, which has a macro level and a micro level. At a macro level, we want to make sure that the entire image looks consistent and balanced. Now for this scene, if I'd used the same workflow of sculpting and texturing all of the foliage, having normals across the whole scene might have looked really busy. And when we look at the concept, the reason the composition works is because there are areas of eye rest that let the focal point stay the focal point. If we just use the exact same workflow for everything because we've built that up, then it could end up having opposite effect or affecting the overall image and composition, which we don't want. It's also the case where if I sculpted the landscape individually and the foliage and every tree individually, then there won't be enough room for optimization through tiling textures and trims and planes instead of geo. So at this macro level, we have to consider the composition and where to take out detail and where to leave it in, which will change how you use other softwares and techniques across a scene. This is where trial and error comes in. I remade those bushes 3 times. One as classic hand-painted brushes, one as having normals, and then finally using a shader, which is where I landed in the end. You would do this kind of exploration in a studio when developing that style, and you owe it to yourself to do it in your personal pieces as well. If it feels off to your eye and you can't explain it, that's your experience and your fundamentals telling you something is off, and you need to listen to it and just do something different. That exploration and R&D will be where you find what works and what doesn't. It won't be right instantly every time. Eventually you'll be able to explain what the problem is and adjust as you go within the same project or across projects, but it takes a step back, taking stock and being definitive. Sometimes a restart is the best thing for you as an artist and for your scene, because you're taking that learnt experience from the first time round and learning for the second time. Then at the micro level, which is the consistency across assets, but made in different ways. So if you've practiced unique assets, but then you need to make a tiling texture, you could sculpt the tiling texture in the same way to use the same muscle memory. Alternatively, maybe you want to explore substance design more. So how do we maintain that same style, but from hand sculpting something into using nodes? Which goes back to the shape, language, and form. Yet again. If you know how you would sculpt something and the level of wear on the edges and how sharp or soft the edges are, then you have to try and recreate that using a different software. Use your benchmark asset as a reference and try to give it the same style of noise or detailing and fidelity as the pieces you've sculpted. You have the experience now, it's just about manipulating the software to achieve the same look. But it's important to consider the size of the asset on the screen. If you have a large asset covered in trims and tiling textures, there will likely be more details. If it's a really small asset, you'll want less detailing to maintain that macro consistency. For things that aren't asset creation, it might be enticing to just follow a tutorial and use that exact same asset, like a water shader or the one in that one wind shader, for example, that we've all seen. It's fine, but it has to work for your scene specifically. So if it doesn't fit the style, then make sure you understand why you're building it that way so you can change the textures or the parameters that you use to fit with the art style that you've built. It will keep that consistency and also help to make your work more unique. that you don't have to be a VFX artist to put some VFX in your pieces. It's important to have a basic understanding so the VFX you do make will actually look cohesive with the rest of the scene. For example, in this scene, in my lighting, I made a light function and hand painted a more painterly alpha so that the light dappled onto the floor and mimicked not only the concept but the more painterly aspect of the textures I'd made. Little things like that will really evaluate your work and bring it all together to make the entire image work together. We're at the end of our talk. I hope it's helped and you've been able to take something away from today. Just to recap, watch movies, play games, build up that visual library, keep practicing, keep transferring that into a physical art style you can recreate. Always ask for permission to use a concept and study those fundamentals even if you think you know them. I think we have some time for any questions about the talk or about this topic in general, so if there are any questions, fire away and I will do my best to answer.
Yeah, for sure. How long did your most recent project take? Are you talking about the ArtStation challenge or the like foresty one? The forest. So the forest I started before I got my first job, so like nearly 2 years ago now in the January. And I started in the March or the May. And I blocked it all out, chucked that up, and then did a couple of sculpts over the next like 10 months. Um, and nothing else, and then just left it. And then I had 2 weeks off of work, and I was like, right, I'm sick of this. So I just finished it in a week, working like dawn till dusk and longer on getting it done and just hyper focusing on getting that one scene finished. So it basically went from like the sculpts and some color blocking out and some light blocking out to finish in a week, which I would not. Yeah, Chris was it. Yeah. Which is a similar story for the ArtStation challenge, so I probably didn't need to justify that. How do you push through the last 20% of your project to finish? I always lose motivation in the last bit, where it's mostly just fixing up and revising. I end up with so many unfinished projects. I think everybody has a lot of unfinished projects, but mostly people get stuck in the first like 20%. Like, how many people have block out graveyards just saved? Like hundreds of Unreal projects that just will never get touched again. But in terms of the last 20%, for me, that's kind of when like tech and stuff starts coming into it. And I think what's really helped me is sort of having a really good support network of like really good people that are kind of there to spur you through it, and they're really helpful and kind. And just basically, I've got a really good group of friends that kind of motivate me, and seeing them doing really cool stuff as well makes me want to improve. And that is what pushes me over the last 20%. Um, so having good people around you that can help motivate you and keep you motivated for longer is super important. It's been really helpful to me. So good people, I would say. What was the ratio of high poly, low poly, arty stuff you were comfortable with versus the amount of tech art stuff that was a bit more of a learning experience for you? Do you think artists should be working on their tech skills? Yeah, so I'm most comfortable, I'd say, with high poly, low poly stuff. It's the stuff that we all learned first, right? So I think probably most people are most comfortable with high poly, low poly stuff, unless you're a material artist or something of the sort. Um, so I could quite happily like make any prop and just crack on and just do it. But when you're making a full environment, it's difficult to just do everything like that, like I say, because of optimization and you can't sculpt water. I mean, you can, but you got to put something on top of it to make it look like water, right? Um, the tech art stuff, again, I've got some fantastic tech artists that I know, and there are some great video tutorials online. But I would say I leave the tech until last minute because it's very scary. Um, and what's good as well is once you've done the tech, you can just migrate it to the next project, so you never have to make a water shader again if you have one. Um, but I do think to become a more sort of rounded artist, and if you want to make more scenes that are a bit bigger and have more sort of involvement, then knowing some tech stuff is going to be really helpful. So I think, yeah, artists should be working on their tech skills. Even prop artists, right? Maybe you want to use masks for an emissive, or you're making a computer screen and you want it to play something on the screen, like shaders are just helpful for everything. So yes, tech is unfortunately really important because it is definitely not my strong point. Do you ever just build a scene without doing any blocking out, just start fleshing things out? Yeah, I have done. I don't do it much anymore because I use concepts now. But before I found the wonder of using concepts. I remember for one of my first environments, I was just making a tree. I got really stressed and I just started sculpting a tree, and then I put a tree in Unreal and then just made the rest of the scene. The composition of that is not fantastic because, like I say, I'm not a concept artist, and they generally tend to have a better handle on things like that immediately. But it did just start with a little panda in a tree that I was making because I just needed to sculpt something. So you can do it like that, but as I've sort of learned and grown, I think it's a bit easier to, and also quicker to have that done beforehand. So do the production stuff first. This is what I need to make. This is how long this will probably take, which you don't stick to. I never stick to it anyway. I'll leave it for far too long and then finish it in like, a week or whatever it is. Um, so you can do it. I don't tend to do it anymore. I just think it goes quicker and a lot smoother if you already know what you need to do. But I have seen, people with prop art for portfolios, for example, make the prop and then kind of build a little, like a grounding environment around it for that. But for big scale environments, I would generally tend to try to plan things to begin with. Um, Any advice on maintaining visual consistency when you're part of a team but aren't necessarily aware of the specific workflows everyone else is using to make their assets, textures, shaders, etc.? Very difficult. I think conversations are the best thing to do in that case. Um, it, when everybody has a different workflow, it is all going to look a little bit different. So coming together as a team and talking about the things that work, talking about what everybody does, talking about what everybody's most comfortable with, and then making that specific workflow, or at least, a, a sort of band between the two. Having that conversation so that you can maintain that visual consistency, and that'll be for everyone, not just you. So it's probably not just you struggling as well, or they just don't care to maintain the visual consistency, So definitely have that conversation, and then once you've done that, it's going to be much easier to have that consistency when you're part of a team. Hey there, I'm not in the industry yet, but with every project so far, I've always somehow relied on having a second eye on the project I'm about to do. Do you get situations where you can't do that because of NDA company related scenarios? And if so, how do you deal with that? Um, Not really, because generally in a studio, I mean, I now work with fantastic people. They're all really supportive. Everybody posts for feedback a lot. Everybody gives great feedback. So when you're in an NDA scenario, there's also other artists that are also in the same NDA scenario, who are going to be giving you feedback, and you're going to be helping each other as a team. So I've not personally experienced that. But in terms of personal projects, you're not under that NDA, so you can just post it everywhere. Or if you have trusted people that always give you good feedback and they know the sort of style that you're going for, then you can just speak to them. But I haven't had that in any company related scenario at all. How would you describe your artistic voice? Have you found it? Are you still finding it? How I would describe it right now is probably just a culmination of what I've already done. So that's, at work, that's all the things that I've watched, all the things that I've experienced, all the things that I've enjoyed looking at, like I was saying about secondary references. Um, I don't think you really ever fully find it. I think some people can have more fleshed out artistic voices than others, especially if they're just getting started. I mean, some people have that very specific art direction, and that's the thing that they make, right? Um, but I think we're always evolving that, and we're always moving forward with that, and we're always getting more influence and more secondary references, and saying, oh, I like that, and I didn't like that about my last project, so I'm going to improve that next time, and I'm going to move into this sort of area instead. And I think that's always continually moving. I know for myself, it's not as cohesive as I'd like it to be, and I'd like to find that. Um, I don't know if you ever really do, but it's nice to try and really sit back and take stock of like, oh, I really love this, or I really don't like that, you know. So yeah, I think it's okay to always be looking for it. Kyra just put a love heart. Thank you, Kyra. Um, I'm doing a group project for an entire year. We're making a game currently in concept phase. How would you apply your technique to a group project game? I think you got to have structure within the group. So, if there's one that has a particularly strong sense of what they want to go for, then coming together and again having that conversation about what exactly you want and building an art bible that everyone can adhere to. It's a little bit different, obviously, because in personal projects it is just you at the end of the day. But if you're in a group project, especially in a uni setting, it's good to concept's great, but it's not always indicative of what the 3D is going to look like sometimes. So you need to come together and look at all of the references, look at everything that you want to make, look at other things that look the way you want it to look, and then come together with this is how we're going to make this is how we're going to make that. And then consistently be ready for feedback and to give feedback until you get to that point. So you've got to make sure everything can sit next to each other and look a certain way, and it maintains across all of that. And if you have that art bible and that strong sense of, right, this is the style of thing that we want to make, then you should be able to maintain that as long as everybody's all on board, which does mean that everybody has to have a certain skill level, but you're only as strong as your weakest man, right? So make sure that everybody understands, everybody knows how to do it, everybody agrees with it, and having maybe spending a week just sitting down and talking and figuring things out is going to make everything much quicker in the long time instead of just stewing on it and trying to figure it out as you go, because then some things are going to fall behind and kind of break that immersion, break that consistency in the final piece. Have you ever dealt with significant changes in creative/art direction as a project develops? How do you maintain your sense of momentum? Um, yeah, yeah. I've restarted a lot of times. I think that's that's kind of, that's exactly what I was saying, in that I've been like halfway through a piece and I've been like, wow, I hate this. This looks awful. And just delete the whole thing and start again in a completely new track and just basically not do what I've done before. Because I know I didn't like that now. So restarting, as heartbreaking as it can be, because you put so much time and so much effort into something, if you know that you don't like it, I personally don't want to put things out that I'm not happy with. You'll never be 100% happy, but I'm at least somewhat happy with. So changing that art direction as the project develops is just, you hit the restart button. Because if you change it as you're making something, then the things before that are going to look different to the things after that, and that's what creates that kind of divide between the two. And in terms of maintaining my sense of momentum, I think that's really different for everyone. For me personally, I have ADHD, so I basically sit and wait for a miracle, and then I'll just go, 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 and hyper focus for like a week straight and forget to eat or sleep, and then just finish it. And then once it's done, it's like, oh, okay. Um, and it's completely different for everyone. I think there's a talk tomorrow or Friday by Ryan about procrastination and momentum and things like that. So if you're interested in learning more about that, then going to that talk would also be really good as well. But it's so different for everyone that it is something that you have to figure out for yourself. But for me, I just sit and pray, basically. Um, how should we approach it? No, it's okay. I think I kind of get what you mean. So there are lots of workflows and lots of different ways of doing things. I mean, there's proprietary engines, right? And you won't be interviewed for a studio that has a proprietary engine that nobody outside the studio has ever seen, and they expect you to already know how to work it, right? Um, which is the same as their workflows. It's, if you know a studio does something, then you can practice it. But when you're applying for art jobs, especially your first art job, just make stuff that you like and make stuff that looks good. And everybody is capable of making stuff that looks good. There is room for at the table for absolutely everybody. And that's from getting your references, getting your feedback, working on your craft. And if you're making stuff that you enjoy, the jobs that you would enjoy would hopefully come your way. In terms of workflow, that's what being a junior is all about. You know, nobody's walking into anywhere and they're expecting you to know immediately how they work and how their studio operates instantly. You know, it takes like 6 to 8 months to figure that out entirely. Um, so you don't have to know everything going in, you know, and I would hope that they're not expecting you to either, because you just need to make good work and be a good artist and have good fundamentals and a good understanding of you know, the basics and the fundamentals of what we do for a job. um, and that's really as easy as it is. Like, nobody's expecting you to, yeah, exactly, just hone your craft and make stuff that you like. Nobody's going to expect you to know exactly how everything works walking in. You know, they're going to have scripts and tooling and all sorts that is relevant to them that nobody else outside of the company would have seen, and they're not going to expect you to know that when you first walk in. So don't stress about it. You know, just do the basics, learn the fundamentals of environment art, and if you can talk on that confidently, then you'll be good to go. You'll be good in an interview, and you will have a good breadth of portfolio work, and that's all you really need. um, Asking, as a 2D artist, would it help if the concept artist told you about their thought process behind the art regarding composition, areas of high detail, color, or would that restrict your creativity and learning process? It would only really restrict you if you let it. Um, if you ask a concept artist, hey, can I use your piece? And they say, yeah, but make sure that this is the composition and this is the area of detail and these are all the colors and blah, 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 which I've never had a concept artist do, then yeah, you'd have to adhere to that because they've only allowed you to use their work based on those factors. But generally, I'll just be like, yeah, sure. If you want to take that and do other things with it, and you know, so my scene's a lot more sort of day lighting, whereas the other one's sort of moody and more like dawn lighting in the concept. So I did change that aspect of it because I felt it looked better for the scene that I had made. You know, um, always make sure that you're giving people credits, but to be honest, if you're asking about their composition and their areas of detail and why they picked the colors they picked and what their influences are, like, it's just cool to talk about art. It might inspire you more as opposed to restricting you. If they're saying you can only do it if you do this, then that's restrictive. But if they're saying, oh, this is why, then that just gives you a breadth of things that you can then go and look at and learn from and experience that also went into making the concept. So I wouldn't say that it was just talk about art. I wouldn't say that it was restrictive.